When I moved into my new house, I was looking forward to a fresh start. My job had brought me to this small, quiet town, and the price of the house was just right. It was an old, two-story Victorian with a spacious yard and a charming, if slightly worn exterior. I could already see myself growing old in this house. Little did I know, my dream would soon turn into a nightmare. The first few weeks were peaceful. I spent my evenings unpacking, getting settled, and exploring the neighborhood. The neighbors seemed friendly enough, although they kept their distance. I attributed it to the small-town mentality where everyone knows everyone else, and strangers are slow to be accepted. It was a Thursday evening when I first met the family next door. I was trimming the hedge that separated our properties when a woman, probably in her mid-40s, appeared from around the corner of her house. She was pale, with dark circles under her eyes, and she moved with a nervous energy that made me uneasy. "Hello," she said, forcing a smile. "I'm Susan, your neighbor. I thought I'd come over and introduce myself." "Nice to meet you, Susan," I replied, wiping the sweat from my brow. "I'm Jake, just moved in a few weeks ago." "Yes, we noticed," she said, her eyes darting around as if she was afraid someone might be watching. "It's a nice house, much better than the old one." I wasn't sure what she meant by that, but before I could ask, a man appeared behind her. He was tall and gaunt, with an unsettling intensity in his gaze. Susan introduced him as her husband, Richard. Richard barely acknowledged me, his eyes constantly scanning the surroundings. "Well, welcome to the neighborhood," Susan said hurriedly before pulling Richard away. "If you need anything, just let us know." That was the first and last time I spoke to the Martins. The encounters after that were limited to occasional glimpses and a nod in passing. Something about them made me uneasy, but I couldn't quite put my finger on it. I chalked it up to the stress of moving and tried to ignore it. Then strange things started happening. At first, it was small stuff. Items would go missing, and then turn up in places I was sure I hadn't left them. The air in the house felt heavy, almost oppressive. I began to hear noises at night, soft footsteps in the hallway, and whispers that seemed to come from the walls themselves. I convinced myself it was just the house settling or my mind playing tricks on me. One night, I woke up to the sound of music. It was an old, haunting melody, the kind you might hear on a gramophone. It took me a moment to realize it was coming from the Martins' house. I looked out my window and saw a dim light flickering in their attic. I tried to go back to sleep, but the music played on, seeping into my dreams and filling them with dark, unsettling images. The next day, I noticed something strange. My hedge clippers were missing. I was certain I'd left them in the shed, but they were gone. Frustrated, I decided to go next door and ask the Martins if they'd seen anything. As I approached their house, I felt a chill run down my spine. The curtains were drawn and the house seemed eerily silent. I knocked on the door, but there was no answer. I was about to turn away when the door creaked open. Richard stood there, staring at me with those unnerving eyes. "Can I help you?" he asked, his voice flat and devoid of any warmth. "Sorry to bother you, but I was wondering if you've seen my hedge clippers. They seem to have gone missing." Richard stared at me for a long moment before shaking his head. "No, haven't seen them." Just as I was about to leave, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Behind Richard, in the hallway, I caught a glimpse of Susan. She was standing there, holding my hedge clippers, her eyes wide with fear and something else, a silent plea for help. I left quickly, my mind racing. Why would Susan have my hedge clippers, and why did she look so terrified? That night, the music started again, louder and more insistent. The light in the attic flickered, casting strange shadows that seemed to dance and writhe. I couldn't take it anymore. I needed answers. I decided to call the police. I explained the strange occurrences and my concerns about the Martins. The officer on the phone was polite but dismissive, telling me that without any concrete evidence, there wasn't much they could do. Frustrated and scared, I decided to take matters into my own hands. I waited until midnight, when the town was asleep and the only sound was the wind rustling through the trees. I crept out of my house and made my way to the Martins' place. The front door was locked, but I found an open window on the side of the house. I climbed in, my heart pounding in my chest. Inside, the house was dark and silent. I moved through the rooms cautiously, trying to avoid making any noise. As I reached the staircase leading to the attic, I heard the music again, faint and eerie. I climbed the stairs, each creak sounding like a gunshot in the stillness. The attic door was ajar, and I pushed it open slowly. The sight that greeted me was like something out of a nightmare. The attic was filled with old dusty furniture and boxes, but in the center of the room was an old gramophone, playing the haunting melody on a continuous loop. Susan was there, tied to a chair, her eyes wide with fear and desperation. Richard stood beside her, a twisted smile on his face. "You shouldn't have come here," he said, his voice dripping with malice. "Some secrets are better left buried." Before I could react, Richard lunged at me. We struggled, the sounds of our fight mixing with the eerie music. I managed to break free and grab a nearby lamp, swinging it with all my might. The lamp connected with Richard's head, and he collapsed to the floor, unconscious. I rushed to Susan and untied her. She was shaking, tears streaming down her face. "Thank you," she whispered. "I've been trapped here for so long." We fled the house and called the police. This time, they took us seriously. Richard was arrested, and the truth about the Martins came to light. They weren't husband and wife, but brother and sister. They had inherited the house from their parents, who had died under mysterious circumstances. Richard had kept Susan prisoner, using the music and the oppressive atmosphere of the house to break her will. As for me, I moved out as soon as I could. The house that had once seemed so perfect now felt tainted by darkness. I've since learned to trust my instincts and to be wary of what lies beneath the surface. Sometimes the most idyllic places can hide the darkest secrets. When I moved into my new apartment, I thought I had found the perfect place. It was located in a quiet, older building with a certain charm that modern complexes lacked. The rent was reasonable, and the landlord, Mr. Harris, seemed like a friendly, if somewhat peculiar, old man. My unit was on the 3rd floor, and I quickly settled into my new routine, enjoying the peaceful atmosphere. It didn't take long for me to notice something odd about my neighbors. They were a couple, probably in their late 30s, who lived directly across the hall. I rarely saw them during the day, but at night I would hear strange noises coming from their apartment, muffled voices, the sound of furniture being moved, and occasionally what sounded like chanting. I tried to convince myself that it was just my imagination, or perhaps some kind of unusual hobby. One night, as I was coming home late from work, I ran into the woman from across the hall. She was petite, with strikingly pale skin and long dark hair that framed her face in a way that made her look almost ghostly in the dim light of the hallway. She was fumbling with her keys, and I offered a polite greeting. "Hi, I'm Emily. I live right across from you," I said, forcing a smile. She looked up at me, her eyes wide and fearful. "I'm Sarah," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "Sorry if we've been disturbing you. My husband, John, and we're going through some things." Before I could ask her anything else, she hurriedly entered her apartment, closing the door behind her. Her behavior only heightened my curiosity, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong. The next night, the noises started again. This time, they were louder and more intense. It sounded like a struggle, followed by those strange chants. I pressed my ear against the wall, trying to make out what they were saying, but it was in a language I didn't recognize. My mind raced with possibilities, each one more sinister than the last. Unable to sleep, I decided to confront them. I grabbed my phone and quietly stepped into the hallway. As I approached their door, the chanting grew louder. I took a deep breath and knocked. The noises stopped abruptly. There was a long, tense silence before the door creaked open. John stood there, a tall, imposing figure with a cold, emotionless expression. "Can I help you?" he asked, his voice devoid of any warmth. I've been hearing noises," I stammered. "I just wanted to make sure everything's okay." John stared at me for a moment before nodding. "Everything's fine. Just a bit of a domestic dispute. Nothing to worry about." I didn't believe him, but there wasn't much I could do. "All right, just wanted to check," I said, retreating back to my apartment. That night, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. I decided to do some research. I started with the building's history and discovered that it had a dark past. Several decades ago, there had been a series of mysterious deaths and disappearances linked to a cult that supposedly operated in the area. The building had been abandoned for years before being renovated into apartments. The more I read, the more convinced I became that something sinister was happening. The strange noises, the chanting, and Sarah's fearful demeanor all pointed to something far more disturbing than a simple domestic dispute. Over the next few days, I tried to keep an eye on Sarah. Whenever I saw her, she looked more haggard and anxious, her eyes darting around as if she was being watched. I wanted to help her, but I didn't know how. Then, one evening, I heard a loud crash from their apartment, followed by a scream. My heart pounded in my chest as I grabbed my phone and dialed 911. As I waited for the police to arrive, I stood by my door, listening to the chaos unfolding across the hall. When the police finally arrived, I opened my door to find John arguing with them, insisting that everything was fine. Sarah stood behind him, her eyes pleading for help. I stepped forward, telling the officers about the noises and the strange behavior I had witnessed. The officers eventually persuaded John to let them in. I watched as they entered the apartment, my anxiety mounting with each passing second. After what felt like an eternity, they emerged, looking grim. "We're going to take them both down to the station for questioning," one of the officers said. "Thank you for your concern. We'll handle it from here." As they led John and Sarah away, Sarah glanced back at me, her eyes filled with a mix of fear and gratitude. I hoped she would finally be safe. The next few days were eerily quiet. I kept to myself, trying to process everything that had happened. Then one night, I heard a knock on my door. I opened it to find Mr. Harris standing there, his expression somber. "I thought you should know," he said, his voice heavy with sorrow. "Sarah is safe, but John, he didn't make it. There was a struggle at the station, and he didn't survive." I felt a strange mix of relief and sadness. "What about the cult, the chanting?" Mr. Harris sighed. "The police are still investigating. It seems John was part of something dark, something that goes back many years. But whatever it was, it's over now." As he left, I couldn't shake the feeling that the darkness hadn't fully lifted. The building still felt heavy, as if the walls had absorbed years of suffering and evil. I decided it was time to leave, to find a place where I could truly feel safe. As I packed my belongings, I thought about Sarah and hoped she had found peace. I knew I had done the right thing by getting involved, but the experience had left a scar. The horror of those nights would stay with me forever, a reminder that sometimes the most ordinary places can hide the darkest secrets. When I moved into my new house on the outskirts of town, I was filled with optimism. The neighborhood was quiet, with neatly trimmed lawns and houses that exuded a sense of suburban tranquility. It seemed like the perfect place to start fresh. I had recently gone through a rough patch in my life, and this new beginning felt like a blessing. My new neighbors, the Johnsons, were a middle-aged couple with 2 young children. They seemed friendly enough, waving at me when I moved in, and Mrs. Johnson even brought over a plate of cookies to welcome me. They lived in the house directly next to mine, separated only by a tall wooden fence. I appreciated their kindness, but something about them felt off. It was hard to pinpoint at first, just a lingering sense of unease. The first few nights in the new house were uneventful, and I began to settle in. Then, one evening, as I was unpacking some boxes in the living room, I heard strange noises coming from the Johnsons' house. At first, it was just a low hum, barely audible, but it gradually grew louder. It sounded like chanting, but distorted, as if it was being played on a broken record. I tried to ignore it, convincing myself it was just their TV or some late-night ritual they had. The following night, the noises started again, but this time they were accompanied by a strange, flickering light coming from the Johnsons' backyard. Curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to take a closer look. I quietly slipped out of my back door and approached the fence. Peering through a small gap between the wooden slats, I saw something that made my blood run cold. In the Johnsons' backyard, a group of people in dark robes were gathered around a small bonfire. They were holding hands, their faces obscured by hoods, and chanting in unison. The flickering light of the fire cast eerie shadows, making the scene look like something out of a horror movie. I watched in stunned silence, my heart pounding in my chest. Suddenly, one of the figures turned and looked directly at the gap in the fence. I stumbled back, my breath catching in my throat. I hurried back into my house, my mind racing. What had I just witnessed? I decided I needed to find out more about the Johnsons. I spent the next day researching online, trying to dig up any information I could find about them. I came across a few news articles that mentioned a series of unexplained disappearances in the area over the past decade, but nothing that directly connected to the Johnsons. That night, the chanting started again. This time, I was determined to confront them. I grabbed a flashlight and made my way to their front door. As I raised my hand to knock, the door creaked open, revealing Mr. Johnson standing there, his face eerily calm. "Can I help you?" he asked, his voice unsettlingly serene. I heard some strange noises coming from your backyard," I stammered, trying to sound confident. "Is everything all right?" Mr. Johnson's eyes seemed to pierce through me. "Everything is fine, just a family tradition, nothing to be concerned about." Before I could respond, he closed the door, leaving me standing there with a sense of dread. I returned to my house, more unsettled than ever. The noises continued, growing louder and more frequent over the next few days. I started losing sleep, the eerie chants echoing in my mind even when they had stopped. Then one night, the power went out. My house was plunged into darkness, and the only light came from the flickering flames in the Johnsons' backyard. I felt a strange compulsion to go outside, as if drawn by an invisible force. I grabbed my flashlight and cautiously stepped into my backyard. As I approached the fence, the chanting grew louder, almost deafening. I peered through the gap again and saw the robed figures, their chanting reaching a fever pitch. In the center of the circle, lying on the ground, was a young woman, bound and gagged, her eyes wide with terror. My heart raced as I realized she was one of the people who had gone missing recently. I knew I had to do something. I fumbled for my phone, my hands shaking, and dialed 911. As I waited for the operator to answer, the chanting abruptly stopped. The robed figures turned in unison, their faces hidden in shadow, and began to move towards the fence. I dropped my phone and ran back into my house, locking the door behind me. The operator's voice echoed faintly from the phone lying in the grass. I barricaded myself in the living room, listening for any signs of pursuit. The house was eerily silent, the only sound my own ragged breathing. Minutes felt like hours as I waited in the darkness. Eventually, I heard the distant wail of sirens, and I felt a glimmer of hope. The police arrived and conducted a thorough search of the Johnsons' property, but by the time they got there, the backyard was empty. There was no sign of the robed figures, the bonfire, or the young woman. The Johnsons denied any wrongdoing, insisting it was a misunderstanding. Without any concrete evidence, the police could do little more than take my statement. I knew what I had seen, but it seemed like the Johnsons had covered their tracks too well. The disappearances continued, and the strange noises persisted. My nights were plagued by nightmares, and the once charming neighborhood now felt like a prison. Eventually, I decided to move away, leaving the house and the horrors behind. But even now in my new home, I can't escape the memory of those nights. I often wonder what became of the Johnsons and their sinister gatherings. I fear they are still out there, hidden behind the facade of suburban normalcy, waiting for their next victim.